Think we're good here? Okay. So today's, or this month's meetup is going to be presenting about networking. A couple of housekeeping things. It'd be nice if you are here in Austin, if you show up. We are going to be eating 3 pizzas today by ourselves. So it'd be great if you were in Austin, if you come to the meetup group. Also, if you're interested in starting a meetup group or in your local area, we are quite willing to help host on the meetup page and promote the GameSalad meetup in that location if you want to try to start a meetup group in your location. Because I know we have a lot of overseas people, and clearly, if you're overseas, it would be very difficult to show up here in person. I think that's all I've got. If you have any suggestions, like I said, we're always looking for more presenters. It doesn't have to be just us here in the office presenting. You can also present remotely if you'd like as well. So if you're interested, hit me up on the meetup group or on the forums. I'm BlackCloakGS on the forums. All right, so we're going to go right muted. Do you guys have questions during the presentation or towards the end?
During is fine.
Okay, so just and Tan.
So this talk is on the networking commands that are on the release version of GameSalad. As you may know, the nightly one has some extra commands that haven't made it out to the public yet. So we're just going to cover what's available for the public version today, which is basically just 2 commands, which let you essentially take a table that you yourself have created, which today we'll be talking about how to actually set that up. There's 2 commands, network GetTable URL here, and there's one there, and then down here, there's the network send table to URL. Let's talk about the send one first. They're pretty straightforward. You have the URL that is the web address that you're going to be sending. You have the table that you're going to be sending. And you have something new in GameSalad, which is this callback attribute. And this applies not only to these 2 network commands, but every single network command that GameSalad will be implementing in the future. And the reason we have this callback attribute is because all the network commands are asynchronous, unlike other commands like animate or set attribute value or whatever. All those commands, when they run, they do their thing, and then they continue on to the next command. With all the network commands, they run but they don't actually complete execution. So, for instance, what happens is the network send table to URL will take the table, send it to the URL, but it won't actually complete until it gets a response back from the URL saying, "Hey, I got your data." And how we tell you that a response come back is from this callback attribute. So what happens is that when this command or any other network command is first run, the attribute that you set here, which is an integer attribute, and it can be on an actor, it can be on the game, whatever you want. It doesn't matter, just as long as it's a valid integer attribute. It's initialized to 0. If something goes wrong actually initializing the command, or if the command receives an error back to the server, that callback attribute will get set to -1. However, if the command comes back successfully from the server, the value will get set to 1. So what you should do is set up a rule saying, if game network post move is 1, then do something that says, hey, this message succeeded, and if it gets set to -1, then do something that says, hey, this message failed. And that's the same for every single network command that you're going to see in the future for GameSalad. So you need to kind of get used to the idea that even though the command's executed, until that callback attribute that you set gets set to 1 or -1, you never actually know that it's finished executing. But you have to basically get your mindset about how to design a game, because things are not going to happen instantaneously. There's going to be a delay. And depending on what's going on the server side, it could be a serious delay or it could be very small, less than a second. So these two commands, basically they take your table, they convert it to JSON data, and they either, this command then sends it off to the server that you created. Its callback is expecting a response from the server that is a success or a fail return value, and Tan will show you that when we get to the server code, how that's done. Once it gets that response back, it sets the callback attribute to 1 or -1, depending on the return value, and then you can handle that. So it's pretty straightforward. There's not really much you can do with that. The GetTable command is very similar. You give the URL that you're going to be receiving the data from, the table that you want to stuff the data into, and again the callback attribute that's on all the network commands. This is a GET request to the server, sending whatever data that you're sending, and this, you can see here the string is hard-coded, but it doesn't have to be. You could stick variables or whatever in there, so you could potentially, have your game, actually call out the different addresses depending on what variables you set. Then it just waits for the response. Once this table is filled in, then the callback attribute will get set to 1 or -1, depending on if the data coming back from the server was good. One thing to note, this is kind of a little annoyance at the moment, is that this get table from URL, the data that the server sends back has to have the same ID as the table that's being filled in. So, for instance, if game grid has ID 1, 2, 3, 4 in the actual XML data for your project, then the server needs to send back saying, hey, I'm sending back to table 1, 2, 3, 4. In the future, that will not be the case. I'm planning in a few weeks to make some modifications to this code so that the server does not actually need to send back the same ID. The idea that the server sends back will essentially be ignored, and whatever data happens to be sent back will be put into this table. So that's sort of an improvement that will be coming up in the future. But for right now, you essentially have to know the ID ahead of time. The server has to know it when it sends back the table data from the network table from URL. That's kind of about it. You basically can either send data and you wait for the response and then do something when you get it back, or you make a request to a server to get data and then wait for the response to get it back here. Some caveats to note is that you can see here that on the base URL, there's, let me open up this in the expression editor. There's some extra data that Tan's added here, that's adding extra parameters to here. I've noticed that if you don't put these parameters in, and you essentially, if this ended up like that, sometimes the URL, the message will not get through to the server, but it will if you add an extra backslash. I'm not a web guy per se, so can't be able to maybe go into more detail about why that's an issue. But if you find yourself communicating with the server and the server doesn't seem to be getting your messages, that's one thing you could try. It's just adding that extra backslash to the end of the URL. That's kind of the only catch, besides the whole fact that when you're doing a GET, the server data has to have the same ID of the table that you put in your table field. So I think I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Tan now, because for these two commands, the meat program for this stuff is actually being able to create your own server, and he's going to discuss how to do that. So, Tan.
All right. So we'll wait for the switch to happen. So we're going to make Tic-Tac-Toe.
I intend to put these slides online at some point, so I'm explaining what tic-tac-toe is. Does anyone not get what tic-tac-toe is? All right.
Okay.
A helpful Wikipedia link included, just in case. Let's see here. So the game we're building features, we're rewriting the backend in PHP. I decided to start with that because that's apparently an option that a lot of people want for really cheap servers. It's not my favorite language, so it will probably not be the cleanest PHP code in the world, but it should be a good start. We're going to have the game backed by a MySQL database, and we'll be using a library that we've written called GetTable PHP. So finding out what GetTable PHP is. If you have a look here, this is kind of what you have to do with the JSON data structure that gets sent to the server, or gets sent to the server from GameSalad, and it's not a natural map to what the table does. For instance, if you take a look, you have to go to children, and then get the first thing in the children, properties, get the first thing in the properties, or the second thing in children, first thing in properties, and then the value. And that actually gets you the data for the row. And after that, you then have to parse the data, the type limited data, which happens to escape slashes if it needs to, if there's a slash inside the text, and then you have to reform the string after you're done, and I kind of got sick of it. So I decided to make a library called GetTable PHP, which after a few more fixes, I'm hoping to place on GitHub so that everyone can have access to it, and we will, over time, try to make versions of this library in different languages. All you do is you create the GetTable object, parse the JSON that comes back. When of course, as per the spec, when the system sends a table to GameSalad, to your server, it encodes it inside the parameters query parameter. So we parse the JSON, and that makes the GetTable object ready to use. So to get the first row, you just get index 0, like you would in an array, and to get the second column, get the first column of the first row, you can do 0, and it would just return that, in this case, it would return the 1 that you were looking for. So you do other things too. For instance, you can get the row by label if you happen to label your tables, get a column of data, get the column by label. Both of these, you can't actually edit the column of data and have it update. You would just get the data there, which is helpful still. You can add a new row to the bottom of the table with a push, just like you would with an array. And it also will run validation to match the data types you define for the table. So for instance, if you said you wanted column 1 to be integers only, it would throw an exception if you tried to push in data that didn't have an integer for that first column. So back to making tic-tac-toe. There are a number of things you have to do when you're running a tic-tac-toe game. First, you have to figure out who the players are, get some basic info about the game. You get the game board, all the actual moves that were made. Figure out whether it's your turn. If it's your turn, actually, send the turn that the player makes, and then figure out also if the game is over and whether or not there was a winner. So what we have in our tic-tac-toe game is we have a table set up called the game info table that gets you the game ID, player 1, the X player, the O player, the current player, and the winner's IDs. Now, the idea behind using integer IDs is what we're setting up for in the future, but won't cover here, is the possibility of hosting like a whole lot of tic-tac-toe games at once. And what you're doing is referencing people by ID rather than just sending a bit of information. Now, this grid, the grid game table, which you set up in the project, represents the actual moves and the grid of the game, or the grid of the tic-tac-toe board. In this case, what we're going to do is we have one column that represents all the different moves, and one column that represents whether that square represents the winning move. We'll see why that happens later. To start with, what you're seeing is we were setting it up as a one. Even though tic-tac-toe is in a two-dimensional grid, we're going to treat it as a one-dimensional one, and it kind of makes things easier later because it makes it really easy. It makes it a lot less data to send because all we're really sending is the one digit for the index instead of saying I'm in square 3 by 3. We're just writing I made my move in square 8. The other thing is it makes it easy to sync later with the method with the way we set up. There are going to be corresponding tables in the database that match that game table, match the table that you saw. So, for instance, there's a games table, and in the games table, it stores the game ID, the 2 players, whether there's a winner, and when the game was created. That way, eventually, if you wanted to, say, create a way for people to choose a game to join or resume an existing game, they can actually see, oh, this game was from November. Okay, let's try that. You probably also want to do an updated ad so you can say when the last time someone made a move is. The next bit is moves, which shows you a game ID, the user that made the move, and what position they made it in. That makes it a really compact way of storing a whole tic-tac-toe game because really it's just a list of moves people have made, and it lets you replay the game later if you want. This one's taking a while to get sent over there. There we go. All right, so we got get game info client side. As Steve mentioned, all we're really doing is we have a network behavior that grabs data from the game and then shoves it into the game info table. And there's a callback attribute that I call network game info, which is used to track the status of the call. For the network functions, I believe it's 0 is 1.
0 is neutral. It means the command has been started.
Yeah.
1 means it's returned successfully, and the data is good.
Yeah.
Negative 1 means that there was an error, and something bad happened.
Okay. So in this case, what we're doing is we're going to make a request to the game table. Now on my end, I have a PHP script, and I will show a little more about how the rest of it's structured. But the important bit you're getting from here is I've created a script that has a class for the tic-tac-toe that represents the tic-tac-toe game. So from the command line parameters, or the request parameters, if you look here, there's a game ID, and then it actually gets the game ID from an attribute in the game and sends that along, and it's asking for the game info. So I have it set up where first off, I grab the get parameters game ID, and I create a new tic-tac-toe game. Now what this does is or tic-tac-toe object, and what it does is it grabs the data for the game from the database. You kind of have the idea is for this object, we set this as the current game ID, we make a connection to MySQL, and then we make the query for the game that matches the game ID. After that, we get the data back, and with that data, we set some stuff in this object that you can use later. So the next bit is after you create that game object, we have a big if statement in this file, and what it does is when it finds the point where it says, okay, the table parameter is equal to game info, then it's going to do some work. First off, earlier I showed you how GetTable makes it easy to parse an existing JSON object, a JSON string that represents a table. This also makes it a little bit easier to create one. So the first argument in GetTable represents each column. So this is kind of how you're defining. It kind of matches how you define tables in GameSalad. So the idea is you have want it to be an integer, and then each row we want a game ID, player ID, or 2 player IDs, current player, and a winner row. So this represents all the rows. So it's columns, then rows. Then we need to set the table name to match the actual table in the game project. This is important because it won't actually update the table otherwise. We're hoping to change that, I didn't mention, but for now, this is what you're going to need to do. And then the last bit is from the game object, we're grabbing the player X, the player 0, the current player, and the winner, and we're populating that table. So what ends up happening is you've got the equivalent of a GameSalad table. Let's see if we go back a couple. So the equivalent of this GameSalad table with all this information filled in. And so then that will, at the end of this code, which I'll show you the full code for, it just echoes back first JSON method. There's also a toJSON method, which will take the GetTable object and create the JSON string that you need to use up. That's how you get the basic game server info. The next step is we want to set up the actual game grid that you're going to play on. And in this case, what I'm doing is I'm doing a loop through the game grid table. And for every cell, I'm going to spawn a new game box actor. And each actor will be placed onto the onto the scene using these two formulas here that kind of, if you go from 1 through 9, it will take that and will automatically arrange them into a grid for you, which is nice and helpful. And then each grid item actor assigns itself to the current spawn index and changes the display based on the grid information. So I'll show you an individual game actor later, but the idea is each grid actor box is responsible for keeping an eye on its row in the game grid table. And so whenever we update that table, it'll automatically update to what it displays for you. So the next bit, you've got to get great. So we've got the network code. This basically says whenever I'm done getting game data, because it's not, you can't see it here, but this is the attribute that the getting the game info table sets. Whenever this gets set to 1, then I actually get an updated set of game data for our game grid. And that updates the game grid table, which then automatically cascades and updates the actual grid you see. Now, that call over here, a get call to the server, which is game ID with the game grid, makes a call back to the PHP server. In this case, we're in the block that gets the one column with player moves and one column for representing whether that square represents a winning square, and set the table to match. And then we have, what we do is we have the Tic-Tac-Toe game grabs the game state from the database. Now what this does is it actually gets us an array of all the different moves, and then it loops through and sets the moves to match the table. The next loop actually figures, if there's a winner to this game, then we're going to set the winner column to 1 so that we can see it later on the client. So the next step, we're waiting for it to refresh over here, is the user actually making a move. Now, each grid box has its own has a copy of this rule. What happens is if this current cell is blank, that means it has 0 set for its move, and the player is the current player, and there is no winner, then you're allowed to click on it. And when you click on it, the things you see are basically what it does is if you click on it, in this case when you release, the idea is you don't actually choose your box until you lift your finger. But the idea is what happens is it'll record your move, which basically does a table write and updates that column or that row in the table to your player ID. Then it changes the game info to say the current player is now the other player, and then it signals, and then it sets another attribute that signals to the control program, hey, I want to send off my game state now to them. So in this case, on the control actor, we have something watching for the attribute for the the attribute, the network tracking attribute for get game data to 100. Whenever it's set to 100, it goes, oh, okay, now I have to get more network, get the updated game info. So the idea is, once you get the game info, you will know. So now it's actually doing a. Oh wait, no, actually, it's not game info. Sorry. So what this does is it posts data to Tic-Tac-Toe for the updated game board. So in this case, we create another table object, parse the table that was sent to the server, and then from the Tic-Tac-Toe game, we get the first column of the existing Tic-Tac-Toe game, and then we update the game with the first column. We get the first column from the table sent to us, and then we update the game with those moves. The column will send an array of all the numbers that represent the grid. And when you're done, you send back status success, and that's what specifies to the server, hey, we're good, we're fine.
That should be specified to the client, which is
to the client, yeah, to the client of the game, yeah. So in the next page, see here. So this is what happens when you run an update game. It loads the game from the database, resets the move count, then it loops through your game grid, and what it does is it checks against what it knows about the game to see if your game, you're making an appropriate move. Like if suddenly if the square has a different user ID than what the original game grid has, then it's going to call you a cheater. And otherwise, it'll actually insert that move into the database. So now the next trick is, how do you let the client, like, you've made your turn. Now, how do you know when your other players made their move? What we need to do is we kind of need to do a polling loop to make sure that we kind of hit the server every second to see, oh, has there an update? Is there an update? Is there an update? And so what we do now, this is probably not the best way, but we'll change this for the final version I post for you. Right now we're doing a 1-second timer. The idea is every second we'll do the get game info request. Now if you remember, the get game info request has what the current player ID is. So what happens is it keeps asking the server, hey, is there an update to the game and am I the current player? When it changes and when the other player makes their move, it swaps the current player, and then the next time you get the data, you find out, oh, you are the current player, and you can make a move. And then it stops polling the server asking for updates. So how do we tell whether the game is over if there's a winner? Well, what happens is this is where we have the server do all the work of figuring out whether there's a winner. And what it does is it figures out, the server goes through all the different boxes to see if there's a win. If there is a win, when game info returns, it tells you who the winner is. And then if there is no winner, you've made 9 moves and no one's won, then it'll return a -1, so you know there was no winner. And in either case, you can't make a move anymore. In the last bit, the game grid second column is set to, then after you've made your game info call, the game will make a game grid call. And if there's a winner, the game grid call will populate that win column with all the grids that are marked for a win, which will allow the grid box to update itself. There are a couple of resources. I'll post these back on the place to download MySQL. A tool I find handy called SQL Pro that allows us to, it's a GUI for accessing MySQL that makes it a lot nicer. And then we'll eventually have, this doesn't work yet, but eventually we will have GetTable-PHP up and on our GitHub page so that you can go and grab a copy. And if you can it will probably make it an open source project. So if you end up making improvements, I think the normal GitHub thing, fork it, make your improvements, send back pull requests, and if you like them, you will help improve GameSalad PHP. What I've done is divide, so from the little snippets of code you saw before, what I've done is divide the code into 3 parts. This index PHP is kind of the default where everything enters, and what actually gets called first when you make a call to the server. What it does is it checks if you have post data. Post data means that you're sending a table to the server, and then if it does, then it does one block. And otherwise, it assumes that you're trying to get a GET request, which means you're trying to get data from the server. If there is a post, we create the table, parse it, update the game like you saw before. If there was a problem doing any of that, we catch an exception, and then we send a status fail back, which we don't handle in the current example of the project, but what you do in a fuller project is go, oh, I've failed. I'm going to tell the user that the network request failed, or maybe try again, and then if after a certain number of times of failure, let the user know. Otherwise, if you're doing a GET, and what you get is based on the game ID that's sent, we create a Tic-Tac-Toe game object, and then we grab we do something based on what you send as part of your table parameter. In this case, if you grab the game list, then this is not implemented in this project yet, but eventually this would allow you to go, oh, this is the list of games available to me. Up here, you've got game info. You saw earlier, this sets up the table for getting the game. Game grid sets up the grid for the game. At the very end, what it does is it echoes GetTable to JSON. And what that does is it takes all the updates you made to the table and then prints out the string representing the JSON for the table, so you don't have to form it yourself. Because if you've seen the documentation, the string isn't a straightforward like CSV file or a grid. It's kind of this complex structure that matches what we actually use under the hood, so it works a little bit faster for what we need. So that gives you that from the game project itself. So what I've done is I've got, is it the right one? I think that's the right one, yeah. So I've got 2 actors I care about. I don't know what actor 1 actually does. That's the leftover. The MCP, and if many of you get the Tron reference, this is the controller for the game, the main game. This does the things like sets up the loop over the table and displays a lot of extra debug text. Oh wait, this is not the version. Ah, this is an old version. Okay. Oh, good thing I looked at that earlier. All right. So I need to get into my storage. Where is it? Tic-Tac-Toe. And Tic-Tac-Toe. All right. I'll have this open. GameSalad there. That's better. All right, that's what I'm more expecting. So basically, grab data from this is a lot of the stuff I showed you before. The MPC is responsible for setting up the game grid, showing debug data, and doing all the network requests. And each grid box is responsible for, let's see here, this is grid index. Oh, so the first thing it does when it gets created is assigns itself to the grid spawn counter. And that's the, I think the index that's set during a spawn loop. So go over here. See, fresh, loaded, yeah, set up grid. So remember when I said I was iterating through all the rows, and then what I do is for each iteration I set this grid spawn counter, which I think counts from 1 to 9 basically. And what happens is when it spawns the actor, spawn and sets its own attribute to match the grid spawn counter, which is what it uses later for all the logic related to playing the game. So what happens when you hit play, you've got a game. You saw the grid. I don't know if you can see it through the network or through webinar, but the grid came off one at a time. And so the idea is that was, you could see the spawning action come up, and it was just forming each box. What we have is we set it now so that when the game starts up, it makes the call to that get info thing. So that's why we now know that the current game is game ID 100. Player X is player 1, O is player 2. There is no winner, and no winner right now. And then the current player's turn is 1. Also tells you your own player ID. So the idea is to see this actually play as a multiplayer game. What I'll do is open another copy and release candidate of GameSalad. Go over here, and if I hit play, it hits the network and thinks, oh, I'm player 1 too, so it's showing the same thing. What we want to do is actually have this person, this player 2. So if this works right, player 2 is all white, they can't click on anything. Player 1 is on its turn, and as long as I have my touch or my mouse button down, it does this. As soon as I release, that's when I make my move. So there we go. That's it makes move. Now you notice the other side updated. Oh, great. My demo broke, of course. Okay, that's better. All right, so let's figure out what changed on that so that I broke it. But the idea is, when I refreshed it, it actually got the correct state for the game. It's like, okay, now it's player 2's turn. So I hit this, player 2, player 1 updates. Go over here. And so you can switch back and forth between the players now. Oh, wait, better block this one.
Too late. No, not that one. That's not.
All right.
There you
All right. NX wins.
Yay.
Yay. To give you a sense of what's being sent back and forth over the wire, let's see here. Local. That's the actual data being sent back when you make the game grid call, which is the call to get all the moves in the board. And this is kind of the format that a lot of that, what GetTable will help handle for you and makes a little nicer. So it'll set all that up and shows you all the different moves. And that is, I think, it. Let's see, so we've got game grid, you got game info. So that gives you all the info, or like the various lines for the actual game in the narrative. Ta-da!
Yeah. So any questions?
So how would you set up like just a random like ID? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so what do you mean? Like, so what I'd probably do is actually create another another call on the PHP side. So I'll show you this real quick, see if this works. Choosing the okay. So the idea is what I do is I make a screen where I would actually make a screen where you could say new game, and what would happen is they would make a call to the server. They would just make a call something like, let's see here. I'm not sure I'm going to get this right the first time, but the general idea is, so I would make a new game actor, in that if the actor touch is pressed, then GetTable from URL, and I made something like what was it? Something along those lines. And so the idea is I would set up the game info table, and I'll just use we'll throw away one for now. And then after, next step would be, let me think what we do. We'd probably do next is if the network status attribute becomes 1. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to make a call to say I want a new game. And whenever it hits the 1, I would just change the main game scene. So change scene to gameplay, I guess. And let's just put this giant new game button on here. So this is where it gets dicey because I'm not sure I'm going to do this part right, but give it a shot. So what I do is I would do so, and then game list. So create a new Tic-Tac-Toe game, and then come back and fill in all the data we want. So we then make sure what happens when we create a new Tic-Tac-Toe game, this is going to be different. If game ID, then probably going to need to So this is probably going to get a little more involved than I'd like, but the general idea is what I do. I'll just do a bunch of to-dos. So the idea here is create a new row in so probably either way I'm going to want a database connection, so move that to the top. So what I'm going to need now is a player ID. Change that to new game, Tic-Tac-Toe, and something like that. So the idea is I would send from here the player ID. So I just realized you're not asking about a random number for the game. You want a random number for the player, don't you?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I thought that's what you're doing.
Yeah. So how would you generate a random ID for a user? Like I think there's.
So I'm not really big on PHP, but essentially what you have to do is when you create a new game, I guess it kind of depends on whether you want the same player to be able to play multiple games. If you do, what you'd essentially have to do is you'd have to, when you first run the game, you'd have to set up an attribute that is the player ID. And of course it'll be 0 at the start because they've never played the game before. So when they first talk to the server, what you do is the first thing you do is instead of setting up a new game, you actually set the player ID. So you say, hey server, I'm a new player, I need an ID. The server would then return back with however it generates a unique ID, and I assume that essentially there would be a database of all IDs, and it would essentially create a new value that wasn't in there and then place it in there and say, okay, hey your ID is now 1, 2, 3. And then what you do is you simply save that attribute, just using the save attribute behavior, and then the next time they play, they load that up and go on from there. So as long as that attribute was saved, and they didn't actually delete the Tic-Tac-Toe game from their device, they still have that player ID associated with it.
And otherwise, you'd have to do a lot more work with login. Like basically, you're governing the idea of sending logins and a few other.
Yeah. If you wanted to make it so that they could move from device to device, then you'd have to have some sort of login system where they say, okay, hey, I'm player ABC, and my password is XYZ, and then the server would read that and assign, if that was a new player, they would assign them an ID, or it would return their ID for that particular name and password. So that's obviously much more complex, but that's the kind of things you can do.
You could use auto increment in a sequence.
Yeah. And so that would be the idea. And then instead of that, there would be new player. Come over here, and then if it said new player, we'll just ignore the fact that we're trying to make a new game. Then what you would do is make new row in player table, and then return row as part of. So then you'd probably do something like this. So smart, valid that. So that's kind of the idea is you'd make a new table, and when you insert the new player into the table, they would actually get back an ID that way. And so in this case, you probably want to do something like that. So they would send you their username, and then you would insert them as a username table. I think what I was asking was, right now we don't have any way to get some kind of unique ID off, either a unique ID off the device, which
unfortunately there's no way. Well, I guess definitely not on Apple. Yeah. There's no way to associate an ID with any particular device. So you'd have to have some sort of login, or the player would essentially have to be associated with that device when you save their attribute on it.
So it's probably a feature expansion. You may want to be able to get some kind of user ID off the whatever network they're on, like a GameCircle or.
Yeah, we could look into that, or Facebook, or whatever. That's actually something we're planning on doing in the future, at least for Facebook.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking with GameCircle and Game Center, things like getting well.
Yeah. But there's various ways you can generate initial login data, or you can make it anonymous. That's always a possibility too.
Yeah, you can number at the beginning of the game to save that to the attribute.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't want to do that totally locally because there's no guarantee that two devices wouldn't generate the same number. So you want to, always have to generate the ultimate ID on the server.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's why actually for what Tan's done here, where he's just giving the username, you'd actually probably want to include a password there as well, so that someone couldn't, if you were Steve and you got it entered in there, and then I entered Steve, and I'd be getting your games, and you'd be getting my games. You have when you're doing player creation and things like that, you have to think about things like security and making sure that you can't get duplicate players, etc.
We're going to fake the whole database part and just return a 3 here, so we can get this to work real quick. And so the idea is we want this to, let's see here, display text. I want to display the table cell value for the player ID table. I think that's the idea. Player ID table, row 1, column 1, which will probably show nothing when we first start. And the idea would be, hopefully, right, get player, username equals blah, and password equals blah. We'll probably want to be able, an ability to get a table on post for this one.
Possibly, yeah.
Because you don't want the passwords to be set in the string. So this one we now want to set the game.
Although from what I understand, you should be able to use HTTPS in the URL as well as HTTP.
No, you can.
Server can.
You can, but the idea is what happens in a request is if you have it in the get part of the request, that gets sent in clear. So only the HTTPS works when you do a post because that's in the body. The body gets encrypted.
Right.
So I believe I've got all the bits I need.
Yes, but to that end, Tan's actually sending the username and password as part of the URL itself. There's no reason why you couldn't actually shove those into a table and then send that securely across using HTTPS. You just send it to a raw URL, and then the URL would unpack the table, read the username and password, and then return the user ID.
All right, so we can probably move on to something else while I do this, unless everyone wants to really watch me try to get this to work.
Are there any other questions?
Any general questions besides tables or whatnot?
Is the callback attribute where the data goes after retrieve?
No, callback is just.
Excuse me?
Can you say it one more time?
What is the callback attribute?
Okay, so the callback attribute is an integer attribute that you create. What happens is that all the network commands are asynchronous, which means that they don't, unlike animate or set an attribute or whatever, they don't actually complete when they're run. They start, but you don't actually know whether they complete or not successfully until that attribute gets set to 1 or -1. So what happens is, you call send table to URL, and that attribute gets set to 0 initially, and then the table is turned into the JSON string and sent across the network, and then the game continues on executing behaviors. What happens is that when the server gets the data and sends back, hey, I got the data, or I failed to get the data, that attribute will get set to 1 if it received a success message, or -1 if it received a fail message. And so you can make a rule that says, if the attribute is 1, then that means that the message succeeded and I can continue on with the game. If it was set to -1, something wrong happened, so you might want to do things like, although the simplest thing to do would be to pop up an error message and saying, I can't play this game anymore because I can't communicate with the server. Or you could do slightly more sophisticated things, like you could have a repeat count, so you'd actually try to execute the send or the get multiple times until you just decide, if it fails 5 times in a row, then the network must be down, and you're just going to have to say the game's over, and you'll have to come back later. So that's kind of how that works. And you have to kind of get your head around this, because this is a new system for GameSalad, where you have a command, and you don't actually know whether it executed correctly or not until later. And it could be, several seconds later, depending on how slow the internet is, or how much work the server has to do. So that's kind of something you have to wrap your head around, because you're not going to be getting instant feedback, and you have to realize that that the command hasn't executed, and you kind of have to wait. So you can't, like, say, right after I send this table, I'm going to animate something saying, command completed successfully. Well, you can't do that immediately. What you have to do is you have to wait till that attribute gets set to 1, and then you execute the animation that says command succeeded successfully.
I think our in-app purchase works the same way.
Yeah, in-app purchase is a similar kind of thing. I'm not exactly sure whether we had a callback attribute or not.
Yeah, there's one. That's what I looked up. You do an in-app purchase.
After store the in-app purchase item.
So there's a change attribute, and that's the callback attribute, effectively. So the change attribute is a lot like the callback attribute of.
And I should note that none of the network commands will run unless that callback attribute is set. If you leave the callback attribute out, you say, I don't care whether this command succeeded. I just want to run it. Well, you still have to set the callback attribute. Otherwise, the message will not get sent out to the server saying, send table or get table. Some other things I just want to mention is performance. With all networking, the secret to fast performance is to send as little data as possible. As you saw from Tan's example there, and you can actually kind of see it in the background there, the JSON format has a lot of data, or a lot of text and stuff in there that isn't the actual data. There's a lot of overhead involved, and it takes time to parse all that out to either create it or read it back in. So basically, if you have like this huge table that you've got, and only a few fields are changing at any one time, you actually might want to think about like breaking that table up into a lot of smaller tables, and just sending like one of the smaller tables out instead of this whole big table, because basically the less data you send, the better your performance is going to be. Actually, to that end, if you want to be on the sort of cutting edge of the network commands, in the nightly builds, there's actually some new commands that have been added. So there's send and get table row to URL, where you can just send a single row instead of the entire table. And there's also get and send attribute to URL, which just sends a single piece of attribute data to a URL. So if you're interested in kind of getting some of the newer features that should be coming up in the next release, you can get the nightly build, and there will be some extra commands there. Also, I want to mention that a future expansion of this will have the option to send and receive the data as CSV data. so that it might not necessarily be as efficient on our side, but it's definitely cleaner on the server side. You don't have to parse as much, and you can see Tan wrote an entire library just to parse the JSON, so you won't have to do that if that's your choice. So that's an upcoming feature that I'll be added in the future. And then, of course, there's all the plays together stuff, which we'll be talking about as soon as we are legally able to.
Any other questions or comments or?
Yeah. Making a network game compared to making a single-player game is exponentially harder. So you do have to kind of get used to things not going as smoothly as you would have liked when you were making your single-player games. That's just part and parcel of the environment of network gaming. But it can be very rewarding, and of course you can, doing social networking and being able to play with other people online is obviously very popular and can really add some oomph to your game. Get it out there, get more people playing it.
Importing images, PNG files, is that something you're looking at implementing anytime soon?
Well, you can already implement. You can already imagine from a server.
Not from a server. Right now, the server is strictly text. It's definitely something we thought about. Basically, I should note that we actually started this code with the Plays Together code, and the Plays Together code can't send binary data over its network, and so that's the reason why we're not doing that right now. That is something that we may look to in the future, but it's not something that's going to happen, let's say, in the next few months.
That's something that would be good for having ad buzz and advertising, etc. So.
Yeah, like avatars and
Yeah.
We all agree it's a good feature. Unfortunately, we have some higher priorities that take precedence over it.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something on the radar for a future improvement in networking down the road.
Yeah, there's a lot of features we want to add, but it's just we've only got so many people working on things, so we're a little understaffed. But yeah, we've got a list of things we want to make improvements for.
I heard there was another question on the line that I heard earlier.
Where are push notifications?
Sorry, say that again? Push notifications?
That's something we're going to add. Well, let's see. So push notifications are part of the Plays Together system, or at least the how we were going to implement it. Again, that's pending, essentially, until all that gets worked out. We are also looking at other push notification systems, potentially, but nothing's been decided yet. It's something we definitely want to do, but we're still working out kind of how we need to do it technically and what systems we're going to be using to do it. So it's something that will probably come up before the end of the year, I would think, but that's as far as I can get.
So, what's the difference between Plays Together and just like a normal server hoster?
Well, the deal with this thing is that you have to create your own servers. So you're responsible for setting up your machine and keeping it running and all that jazz. Plays Together is basically a service that does all that for you, so you don't have to worry about it. It handles all the database stuff. It handles all the parsing of the data on the back end and whatnot. It also has a lot of nice features about keeping track of games in progress, keeping track of user IDs. It handles a lot of overhead. And we actually started the networking system for GameSalad using their system. We ran into some financial and legal issues with them, and that we are continuing to work out. But we are hoping to continue using their service sometime in the future. We're not sure when, but we are reasonably confident that it will come to pass, that we will be able to use that. And that opens up a whole lot of new features and new commands that makes networking a lot easier to make multiplayer games. But we'll, like I said, whenever all the issues with lawyers and whatnot get worked out, we'll let everybody know.
So we've got a basic version, assuming here that, let's see here, when you press the button, you get a new player ID, which is player ID 3, and then I've readjusted the game to actually work with player ID 3. So
neat.
Now, what you'd end up doing instead is for this change get player ID to actually access the database, try to see if there's a user password that matches, if not, create a new user, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And that's something that the Plays Together system would do for you. So it's basically, it makes things easier on the client side. But yeah, for right now, you're responsible for writing your own server code and setting all that up. Yeah. You do have the advantage, though, of basically you can do anything on the server you want to. So I mean, you could have the server handle, you can make a massively multiplayer game if you really have the ambition to do it and the talent. Have the server, handle hundreds of players playing a game simultaneously, if that's what you wanted to do. The sky's the limit. It's whatever you can code. But of course, you do have to be able to code.
All right, thank you everyone for coming to the meetup. I want to give big thanks to Steve and Tan for their presentation on networking. We'll be releasing the template and the server source code out on GitHub and our website. And next month will be handwriting recognition and gestures.